There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It shows up after a full day of doing everything right, answering everyone, showing up for everyone, saying yes to the version of yourself that other people seem to prefer. And still, somewhere underneath the competence, there is a quiet, persistent hum of absence. Not sadness exactly. Something closer to distance, as if you have been watching your own life from several feet behind it. You have likely never named this precisely. You called it responsibility. You called it being a good friend, a good partner, a good employee, a good son or daughter. You called it maturity or humility or simply the price of being someone other people can rely on. And for a long time, that explanation held. It was reasonable. It was even admirable. But there is a version of this pattern that has nothing to do with virtue. It is the version where your choices were never really yours to begin with, where the job, the relationship, the opinions you hold in rooms full of people, the version of your personality you perform at gatherings, all of it was built not from an internal compass, but from a lifetime of reading rooms and adjusting accordingly. You became fluent in what others needed from you long before you became fluent in what you needed from yourself. That fluency did not arrive by accident. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the persona, the mask a person constructs to navigate the social world. He did not consider the persona inherently dishonest. Every person needs one. The danger, he warned, begins when a person forgets that the mask is a mask. When the performance becomes so total, so seamless, that the person wearing it loses access to whatever face was underneath. Most people never notice this happening. It happens gradually, the way a room grows dark as the sun sets. No single moment announces itself as the moment you stopped living your own life. There is no dramatic turning point, no single betrayal you can point to. There is only an accumulation of small surrenders, each one reasonable in isolation, each one justified by context, until one day you look around and realize the architecture of your entire existence was built to satisfy an audience you never consciously chose. You are that audience's architect and its prisoner. This is not a story about weak people. It is often the opposite. It is usually the most capable, most perceptive, most emotionally attuned people who fall into this pattern most completely, because they are the ones skilled enough to read exactly what a room wants and disciplined enough to deliver it. Their gift becomes their trap. Jung had a phrase for the parts of ourselves we abandon in order to be acceptable to others. He called it the shadow. Not because these parts are evil, but because they exist outside the light of conscious awareness, pushed there by years of learning which parts of you were welcomed and which parts made people uncomfortable. What gets pushed into shadow does not disappear. It waits. It resurfaces in irritability you cannot explain, in resentment toward people who did nothing wrong, in a persistent sense that your own life belongs to someone else's story. And the strange cruelty of this arrangement is that the people living most entirely for others are often praised the most for it, called selfless, called easy to love, called low maintenance. No one calls it what it actually is. A slow, quiet erosion of the only life you are ever going to get. What follows are 7 signs of this erosion, not as accusations, as a mirror. Some of them will feel obvious the moment you read them. Others will take longer to recognize, and because recognizing them means admitting how long they have been running your life without your permission. The first sign is easy to miss because it disguises itself as kindness. The first sign is this: you feel guilty before you even know why. Not guilt tied to any specific wrongdoing. A generalized, low-grade guilt that activates the moment you consider doing something purely for yourself. Taking a day off without justifying it. Spending money on something with no practical use. Saying no to a request without softening it into an apology wrapped inside 3 explanations. The guilt arrives instantly, automatically, as if it were installed rather than earned. That is because it was installed. Somewhere earlier in your life, wanting something for yourself was met with a consequence. Maybe not punishment in any dramatic sense. Sometimes it was subtler than that. A flicker of disappointment on a parent's face. A sibling who needed more, so your needs quietly became optional. A social environment where the version of you that asked for things was less welcome than the version of you that simply provided them. You learned, long before you could articulate it, that your worth was conditional on your usefulness. Jung would call this the formation of a false self built entirely from external approval. Not false in the sense of fake, but false in the sense of unrooted. A self with no independent foundation, entirely dependent on the reactions of whoever happens to be in the room. Remove the audience, and there is no performance left to give, because there was never a self underneath the performance that existed independently of being watched. This is the first sign because it is the quietest one. The second sign is louder, though people rarely hear it correctly. You have an almost supernatural ability to sense what people want from you before they ask. You know when your partner is disappointed before they say a word. You know when a coworker is upset in a meeting before they express it. You know how to phrase a request so it lands the way you intend, how to time a joke so it diffuses tension, how to adjust your entire emotional register within seconds of entering a new environment. People often call this emotional intelligence. Sometimes it is. But there is a version of this skill that is not intelligence at all. It is hypervigilance wearing a more flattering name. A nervous system trained by necessity, not curiosity, to scan constantly for danger disguised as disapproval. Children raised in unpredictable emotional environments where love or safety depended on correctly reading an adult's mood often develop this skill early and permanently. It becomes so automatic that by adulthood it no longer feels like scanning. It feels like personality. You call it being perceptive. What it actually is, more often, is a survival mechanism that never received the memo that the danger has passed. And here is the part that rarely gets said clearly enough. This skill did not make you closer to other people. It made you a mirror for other people while remaining a stranger to yourself. You became so accurate at detecting the emotional weather around you that you stopped checking your own forecast entirely. Ask yourself honestly right now what you want. Not what would be reasonable, not what would make sense given your obligations, not what would disappoint the fewest people, just what you want. If the question produces static instead of an answer, that is not a personal failing. That is the second sign functioning exactly as it was built to function. Most people living for others cannot answer that question quickly because the muscle required to answer it was never exercised. It atrophied in childhood and has been quietly absent ever since, replaced by a far more developed muscle, the one that answers instantly and fluently what everyone else wants. There is a third sign, and it is perhaps the most socially rewarded of all 7, which is exactly why it is the most dangerous. It looks from the outside like generosity. The third sign is this: you have become the person everyone relies on, and no one thinks to ask what you rely on. You are the one who remembers birthdays, the one who shows up early to help set up and stays late to help clean, the one friends call first when something goes wrong, and the last one anyone thinks to call when they simply want to check how you are doing. You have built, without ever consciously choosing it, an entire identity around being indispensable. Indispensability feels like safety. If you are useful enough, valuable enough, essential enough to enough people, surely you cannot be abandoned. Surely you cannot be discarded. This is the quiet, unspoken arithmetic running underneath the generosity. If I give enough, I will finally be secure. But security built on constant output is not security at all. It is a treadmill with no stopping point, because the moment you slow down, the fear returns that your worth was never inherent to begin with. It was only ever transactional. Jung wrote about the danger of a life organized entirely around what he called adaptation to the collective, rather than what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming a distinct, whole person, rather than a reflection of everyone else's expectations. A person who has adapted too completely to the collective, he warned, eventually experiences a kind of internal bankruptcy. Not because they gave too much, because they gave from a place that was never being replenished. You cannot pour from a self you have never been permitted to visit. And the people around you, the ones who benefit from your endless availability, rarely notice the cost because the cost is invisible by design. You have gotten so good at absorbing exhaustion quietly that no one around you has ever had to witness what it actually takes to be you. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. Not because the people in your life are cruel. Most of them are not. It is simply the mundane, unremarkable truth of human behavior. When something is given freely and endlessly, people stop noticing it as being given at all. It becomes ambient, expected, invisible, the way air is invisible until it is suddenly gone. This is the third sign because it disguises depletion as virtue. The fourth sign is quieter still and stranger. You struggle to know what you actually enjoy, separate from what you are good at or what earns approval. Ask yourself what you would do this weekend if absolutely no one would ever know about it. No photos, no mention to a friend, no sense of accomplishment to report back to anyone. Just the activity itself, alone, unwitnessed. For many people, this question produces an uncomfortable blank. Not because they lack interests, but because so many of their interests were adopted rather than discovered. The book club joined because a friend wanted company. The hobby picked up because it photographed well. The career path chosen because it pleased a parent who never explicitly asked for it to be chosen, but made their approval unmistakably conditional on it. Layer upon layer of preference borrowed from other people, until the borrowing became so total that locating an authentic preference underneath it all feels almost archaeological. This is not indecisiveness. It is the long-term consequence of a self that was never given permission to want things independently, and so learned instead to want whatever kept the peace, kept the approval, kept the relationships intact. Jung believed that a person cut off from their own genuine desires does not simply feel unfulfilled. They feel, at a level beneath language, like an imposter in their own existence, because they are living someone else's version of a life, performed so convincingly that even they have started to believe it belongs to them. It does not. And somewhere underneath that performance, quietly, persistently, something in you already knows. The fifth sign is one most people mistake for a compliment. You are told often that you are easy. Easy to be around, easy to work with, low maintenance, undemanding. People say this with warmth, as though it were the highest praise they could offer, and for years you likely received it as exactly that. But listen to what the compliment is actually describing. It is describing the absence of your needs from the room. It is describing a person who has become so skilled at not inconveniencing others that their own inconvenience has become invisible, even to themselves. Somewhere along the way, you learned that needing things came at a cost, and so you began minimizing your needs before anyone else had the chance to minimize them for you. You edited yourself down to a version small enough to never be a burden. That editing did not begin as a choice. It began as an adaptation. Children who grow up in households where emotional bandwidth was scarce, where a parent was overwhelmed or distracted or themselves unwell, often learn early that the fastest way to receive love is to require as little of it as possible. Need less, and you will be resented less. Want less, and you will disappoint people less. It is an elegant, devastating logic, and it works exactly well enough to become permanent. You did not become easy because you have fewer needs than other people. You became easy because you learned long ago what happened when you expressed the needs you had. Jung wrote that whatever is denied expression in the conscious life does not vanish. It moves underground and continues operating from there, usually in ways the person cannot trace back to their origin. The needs you buried in order to be easy did not disappear. They surfaced instead as chronic fatigue with no medical explanation. As a persistent, low simmer of resentment toward people who never even knew there was anything to resent. As a body that aches in ways a doctor cannot fully account for, because some exhaustion is not physical in origin. It is the exhaustion of a self that has spent decades performing weightlessness. The sixth sign is subtler than all the others, because it looks on the surface like connection. You find yourself absorbing the emotional states of the people around you as though they were your own. Their anxiety becomes your anxiety. Their disappointment becomes something you carry for days. Their unresolved conflict with someone else, a conflict that has nothing to do with you, becomes a weight you quietly take on and try to manage from the sidelines. This is not empathy in its healthiest form. Healthy empathy allows you to understand another person's feelings while still remaining anchored in your own separate experience. What you are describing is something closer to enmeshment, a dissolving of the boundary between where another person's emotional life ends and yours begins. And this dissolving did not happen because you are unusually caring. It happened because somewhere in your history, someone else's emotional state was your responsibility to manage. A parent's mood that determined the temperature of the house. A caregiver whose stability depended, even subtly, on your compliance and calm. You learned to monitor others because your own safety once depended on it. Jung called the unconscious absorption of another person's psychological material a kind of participation mystique, an old anthropological term he borrowed and repurposed, describing a state in which the boundary between self and other becomes so thin that a person can no longer clearly distinguish which feelings originated where. It is, he suggested, one of the oldest and most primitive states of human consciousness, and one of the hardest to outgrow, because it disguises itself as love. It is not love. It is the absence of a boundary that was never modeled for you, being mistaken generation after generation for closeness. And underneath all 6 of these signs, quietly accumulating, is a 7th, one that most people cannot see until it is nearly too late to ignore. The 7th sign is this: you no longer know with any certainty who you would be if no one was watching. Not in the small sense of preferences, which the 4th sign already touched, in the deeper sense, the architectural sense. If every relationship that currently defines you dissolved tomorrow, if every role you perform, the reliable one, the easy one, the one who reads the room and adjusts, if all of it were suddenly unnecessary, what would remain standing? Most people who have spent a lifetime living for others cannot answer this question without a long, uncomfortable silence. And that silence is the actual wound, not the exhaustion, not the guilt, not the hypervigilance or the enmeshment or the erased needs. Those are symptoms. The wound underneath all of them is the absence of a self sturdy enough to exist independently of an audience. A structure built entirely from load-bearing walls made of other people's approval, so that removing the approval does not simply hurt, it threatens collapse. Jung spent much of his life studying exactly this condition, though he rarely used language this direct. He called the process of building an authentic, independent self-individuation, and he considered it the central task of a human life. Not a task everyone completes. Most people, he observed, never fully begin it. They spend their entire existence inside the persona, inside the mask constructed for the benefit of others, and they die having never met whatever was underneath it. He did not consider this a moral failing. He considered it the tragic default of a species raised inside families, tribes, and societies that reward conformity far more reliably than they reward authenticity. The mask is not optional. Every person needs one to function inside a social world. The tragedy is not wearing the mask. The tragedy is forgetting, so completely and for so long, that it was ever a mask at all. Here is where this becomes difficult to sit with. If you recognized yourself in these 7 signs, the instinct many people have is to immediately begin fixing, to find the technique, the boundary script, the 5-step method for finally living authentically. That instinct itself deserves scrutiny, because it is quite often simply the same old pattern wearing new language. Performing self-improvement for an imagined audience is not different in kind from performing likability for a real one. Both are still organized around being witnessed favorably. Neither is the same as simply being. The actual work Jung described is slower and far less satisfying to narrate. It involves sitting with the discomfort of not knowing what you want, without immediately reaching for an answer that sounds acceptable. It involves noticing the guilt that arrives the instant you consider your own needs, and instead of obeying it or fighting it, simply observing it the way you might observe weather. It involves tolerating the disorientation of disappointing someone, even someone you love, and discovering that the disappointment does not, in fact, end the relationship or end you. Most people flinch away from this discomfort long before it produces anything. They return to the mask because the mask, however suffocating, is at least familiar. The unknown self underneath it offers no such guarantee. It might be someone likable. It might be someone strange, difficult, quieter than expected, louder than expected, someone who wants things that inconvenience the very people who have depended on your accommodation for years. There is no promise that what you find will be comfortable. There is only the promise that it will be yours. And this is the quiet, unglamorous truth Jung arrived at after decades spent studying dreams, myths, and the psychic lives of his patients. He did not believe the goal of a life was happiness, in the way that word is commonly used. He believed the goal was wholeness. And wholeness, unlike happiness, does not require the approval of anyone else in the room. It requires only the willingness to stop asking for it. Somewhere inside every person who recognizes themselves in these 7 signs, there is a version of them that has been waiting a very long time. Not to be rescued, not to be fixed, just to be noticed by the one person whose noticing was never actually optional. You already know who that person is. You have simply spent your entire life looking everywhere else.